everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Nader. In this video, we're going to go over the for of loop in JavaScript. This is going to allow us to iterate or loop over what are called iterables in JavaScript, which turns out is quite a lot of things that we would want to loop over. So this is just another way to kind of loop over things without having the more clunky or larger format style of a for loop that we've seen so far. Let's just get right into it. All right, so I have kind of the syntax for this for of loop here on my screen. I just drew out a very simple example here, and then we'll actually look at the documentation together as well as some examples in actual code. So the way that this for of loops works is just like this. We have the for keyword, then we have this set of brackets, regular brackets, just like we would for a regular for loop. However, what we put inside of these parentheses are very different than a regular for loop. If you remember from the for loop videos, we kind of had the initializer and then the condition and then the updater, which is the three separate sections of a for loop, which is pretty consistent across most languages. This loop, however, is quite more compact and much simpler, but it is definitely less featureful. So let's see how it works. We inside of here, it's just one statement. We have usually a const, but we can do a let. We'll say const some value, and this some value is the variable name. So this orange part here can actually be any variable of our choosing that we want to use within the loop. Very similar to how maybe a function parameter might work, for example. Then we have the of keyword, which is where the name for of loops come from. And then we have this blue thing, which I called some iterable. That's just a fancy way of saying something like an array, a string, a map, a set, or there's a couple of other iterable objects which we'll look at in future more advanced videos as well, and I'll show you in the documentation what the names of those might be. But inside of these curly brackets after this set of parentheses, we can then put our code. And we can actually use the value, which is the orange thing that we declared, just like we would in any other loop. So let's just quickly look at the documentation for this and then jump right into the code, because that's probably the easiest way to actually see how this works. So let's pull up Google really quick. And I'd like you to search for of loop JavaScript. Once you have your search results, I like to kind of go through the MDN page, the documentation from Mozilla for the for of loop for JavaScript. So I'll just open that one up. Let me zoom in a little bit here. So you can see here that the for of statement executes a loop that operates on a sequence of values sourced from an iterable object. You know what's funny? It's like sometimes for beginners, it's like they purposely make it complicated and like all this cryptic words to use. This is kind of the purpose of these videos as well, is just to kind of decipher some of this craziness. It does make sense from a very technical standpoint, but we'll go through kind of how this works in more plain English shortly. Iterable objects include instances of built-ins, such as the array, which I mentioned, string, something fancy called a type array, maps, which we've seen recently, sets, which we've also seen recently, and then a couple of other things that we'll get into in future videos. So just as a quick example that they have here, they're saying if you have this array, array 1 is what they're calling it, which is an array with 3 strings in it, A, B, and C, you can do this for of loop that looks like this. You can say for const and then the some variable, which I had in my diagram, of, which is the keyword for the for of loop, and then the actual thing we're looping over on the other side of the of. So this, they're basically saying loop through each item inside of array 1 and call it element, and then console log out that element. All right, so let's just get right to the code and start actually seeing how this works with some examples. So I'll just say for of arrays.js. I'll create an array right here. I'll just say const characters, and in here, let me put some of my maybe favorite characters from some movies or shows. Let's do our friend Frodo. We have Harry, and then maybe we have, I don't know, Thanos, for example. Thanos. My gosh, so hard to spell. Okay. So in this array, we have 3 strings, right? We saw that we can use a for loop in previous videos to loop through this. I just want to do that first, because if we see an example using for loops, the normal for loops, right beside the for of loops, you can kind of see some discrepancies between the two. So let's just do a regular for loop. And if this is new to you, I have a video on how the regular C-style for loops work in JavaScript. So I'm going to create a variable to keep track of the index. I want to loop while I is less than the characters.length, which is the length property of this array, which is going to be 3, and I want to do I++. Then I want to console.log out the characters at that index. So characters at 0, 1, and 2 to get Frodo, Harry, and Thanos respectively. Now, let's run this code and we'll see that we indeed do get these 3 characters printed out, which is fantastic, right? Let's add another character in here. Maybe we'll say, I don't know, Gandalf, for example. And if I run this again, we'll see that we do get a bunch of characters printed out with the new character added. If I was to remove these 2 characters at the end, for example, and then I print this one more time, we'll see that this updates automatically, right? So it's actually changing depending on the size of this loop. Let me add Thanos back in, and I'll add my friend Gandalf back in. Gandalf. And you know what, let's just go with Yoda as well. Why not? Let's just get a whole bunch of characters in there. Now I want to show you how this would work with a for of loop. So keep in mind, the for of loop only works with what are called iterables. And in plain English, that effectively means something that we can loop over that's designed to be looped over internally. We can actually create our own iterable objects in the future. However, that is a bit more advanced, and we'll get to that in future videos where we start looking at things like prototypes and classes and things like that. So how does this work? So we can say for, and I want you to notice the difference between these 2 syntaxes with the regular style of for loop and then the for of loop. I can say const, and I can say character of this characters list. Now this might look confusing when you first look at it because it looks like they're saying the same thing, but we're saying create a const character every time you loop over this characters array in this case. And each item that you give to me, just call it character. So I can use it inside of the for loop here. So I can say console.log character, just like that, right? And I'll put a little kind of statement here where I'll do a little dash, set of dashes, just so that we can see the separation between these 2. Clear out my console, run it again, and you can see that these work the exact same way. Right? So we have all our characters being logged out, the 5 characters in our character array. So when would we ever use this, and why is this useful, right? I hope you can see that this loop just feels more compact. There's less going on in it. It's just kind of easier to read. We can kind of read it in English, right? We can say for each character of this character's thing, then do something with that character. Right? If you were to read this though, it's kind of, unless you're a programmer, it's hard to kind of figure out what's going on. We're saying for and then I, it's like, okay, like maybe I can name this as index, but then like why do I need that? And then like characters.length, okay, and then like I or index ++, okay, great. There's no real indication of what's really happening here, unless you kind of dig into the code a little bit deeper. Okay. So that's where the for of loops come in. They're much more concise, compact way to kind of just quickly loop through an iterable object like an array without worrying too much about the index. What we could do as a mistake here, for example, is we could index it incorrectly. So for example, if I accidentally tried to access the index +1 here for some reason, right? And this actually does happen quite often where we're off by 1 or we are indexing the wrong thing. We'll see that we actually skip Frodo, right? And we try to go 1 past Yoda, which doesn't exist, right? But this loop doesn't suffer. So I want you to notice though that we are actually losing something here. With the for loop like this, we have access to the indices, right? If we structure it like this, we have access to pretty much whatever we want because we control the loop very explicitly. We can have multiple initializers and multiple updaters, for example, and even multiple conditions. But with a for of loop, it's much more compact, but we also lose some of that functionality, right? Notice that we don't have access to the index. So we can't manipulate an array through a for of loop because we need an index to change the value at that array. Let me show you what I mean. So let's say that I want to capitalize each item inside of this array. What I could do is I could say characters at that index is equal to characters at that index dot to uppercase, just like that, right? And if I then, after this loop is done, instead of console logging it here, I'll just show you what happens to this loop. I'll just do console.log characters. And if I run this, what we'll see is that I've capitalized all the items inside of my characters list. And this even changed it for my future list down here, right? Because I've changed it up here. So I'm permanently changing the values inside of this characters array because I'm able to use the index, right? Now let me comment this out over here. And just to prove to you what happens if I do that, this will keep us with our original loop, our original array of characters, because we're not changing it anymore. And if we try to do something in here, if I said character is equal to character.to uppercase, let's see what happens. There's a couple of issues with this, and let's try to fix them one at a time. If I run this, we'll see that, oh, assignments to a constant variable. Well, I said const character, right? I can't assign something back to this variable because it's a const. So maybe, okay, maybe if I make this a let instead, just like that, maybe that'll fix this issue and I can actually change this character array. So let's see what happens. I'm gonna actually also console.log out our characters down here just so we can see what happens once this loop is complete. So if I do this, seems like nothing really happened. Right, so I have my characters array. I have each character being printed out, not into uppercase because I printed it out before that statement, and I'll show you what happens if we do it after in a second. But most importantly, this array has not changed, right? Even though it looks like we're assigning to change that variable, we're only changing it temporarily. Let me show you what I mean. If I take this log, and now I put it after, just like this. So one before and one after. Let's see what we get. You can see that we are uppercasing the character each loop. But what's happening here is that this is actually a copy of that item. Okay? And this is because these are all strings. If this was not a string, we could manipulate that item if it was an array, for example, or an object, because as we saw in previous videos, arrays and objects are pointed to or references to the actual object in memory. But with basic types like numbers and strings and some of the other primitive types, we cannot manipulate arrays like this. However, we can if the items in the array are things that are not primitive types. So just be aware of that difference. It does come up very often, and sometimes you might need to use a loop like this to actually manipulate things that have primitive types in them as an array, or sometimes you don't even need access to the index because you're not doing any manipulation at all. You just want to print stuff out or use that item one at a time. Then you can use a for of loop, and that might be the easiest way to go. Okay, we're going to see lots of examples going forward with both of these styles of loops. This is just kind of scratching the surface with this concept. So next, I want to show you that this is possible with other iterables, as I mentioned earlier. So let's do this a bit faster with some of the other ones. So we'll do strings. So I'll just say const message equals today is a wonderful day, just like that. Okay. And we can now loop over this, both with array indices, because a string technically is an array of characters, but we can also loop through it using a for of loop. So I could say for const character of message, right? Then I can console.log out that character. Let's see what happens if I do this. I'm going to run node for of strings, and you can see that I get each character printed out on a line, right? And if I wanted to, for example, I could say character dot to uppercase, and if I console.log out the message, keep in mind, again, this is not going to change the message. This is only going to change it inside of that loop temporarily. I actually get everything uppercase printed out. Sorry, this is a little bit cut off here, but this just does say that this is today's a wonderful day in lowercase, like we have up here, same string. But each time we actually loop through this, we can uppercase it if we so wish, without worrying about changing the original string here. Okay, so that's pretty cool. This is a nice way to loop through strings, much easier to read than a kind of indexed for loop. And I just want to also mention that you've seen me so far do 2 of these, and you'll sometimes be tempted to do something like this. You'll say for const I or const x of the thing, right? I encourage you not to do that. Very similar to how I mentioned in the functions video. Try to be quite explicit with your variable names. One nice thing is that if you do this, you actually don't have to write that many comments in your code, because your code can be more self-documenting because it reads more like English, right? For each character of the message, print out that character. Okay, now let's go to the interesting ones, which are the more recent videos that we looked at. We'll do for of, and we'll say maps.js. So if you haven't seen maps, definitely refer to the maps video to see how this works, very similar to an object. However, this is where maps definitely shine when compared to objects, which we'll see shortly. So we can create a new map, and we'll say const my map is equal to a new map, just like this. And we'll say my map.add, or .set, sorry, I'm thinking of sets. Let's just say I want to add a name, and then I'll say natter. And then I'll say my map dot set, and I'll say age, and then my age can be, let's just say 20. Why not? If you think I'm 20, that's flattering. My map dot set, and then we'll say let's just say friends, and I'll say that my friend's name is Mr. Monkey. Okay. Perfect. So that looks pretty good, right? Basic map, a lot of primitive types in there. We can do some things like have arrays and other maps and objects as the types, but I just want to show you how we would loop over this. Now, with the looping of maps, this is not as used all the time, because maps are mostly used to check to see if something is in the map and then getting the value out of the map kind of one at a time. However, there are certain cases where you do kind of want to print out things from the map kind of entirely, or check what's in the map in its entirety, and this is an easy way to do that. So we could say for const, and then I can say item, for example. I'll just keep it generic just so you can see what's happening here. In of, I always say in, of my map, and I can console.log item. All right, let's see what this gives us. So if I run node and then for of maps, it looks like we get back something kind of interesting here, right? We are, each iteration that we're printing out each item, we are getting back an array. So think about why that might be for a second. We're getting back an array because a map is actually key value pairs, right? So if I rerun this real quick and I add a log in here and I say my map, and let me just rerun this really quick, we can see that this map is a set of key value pairs, right? Natter points, or name points to Natter, age points to 20, friend points to Mr. Monkey, right? And if we were kind of asking, okay, give me the values or the entries inside of this map object, it kind of makes sense that we would want back the key and the value. There are cases where we would only want the keys or only want the values, but by default, when you use a for of loop in this way with a map, you actually get back an array where the first thing in the array or index 0 is the key, and the second thing in the array or index 1 is the actual value. There are nice compact ways to make this much easier to read. However, the default behavior looks like this. Okay, so if I wanted to access just the key, for example, I could do this. And if I wanted to access just the value, for example, I could do this. And if I rerun this code, you can see that now I'm actually pulling out the actual keys and values themselves from that array inside of this for of loop for my map. Perfect. Okay. Now, let's go through the same idea for sets before we look at how objects are a little bit wonky with for of loops. So I'm going to create a new file, I'll call it for of, and I'll do sets.js. And I'll create a const my set is equal to a new set. And I'll just add a couple of things to the set just to get us started. So I'll say my set dot add. These APIs are always slightly different, set and get and add and things like that. Sometimes I forget, sometimes I remember. Let's just add hello to the set. Let's add monkey to the set, and sets work this way, right? If we add the same item multiple times, they get ignored. And for example, if we do a number here, 10 and 11, and then I'll say my set dot add, and I will do some maybe Boolean values, for example, right there, like true. Okay, so if I console.log out this my set, we'll see that this has all the values that we would expect minus the duplicate values. So if I do for node for of sets, oops, I got too excited with my tabbing there. We'll see that our set has 5 items, right, with the monkeys duplicates removed. Hello, monkey, 10, 11, and true. Okay, perfect. So if that looks a little bit wonky to you, definitely check out the sets video. We go over this in more detail there. However, we can also use a for loop for this, a for of loop specifically. So I can say for const item of my set, I can console.log out that item. Now, before I actually run this, I'd like you to think, is this going to give us back an array, do you think, for each item, or is it going to give us back just the item itself? Okay, let's take a look. So it turns out we just get the item itself, right? Because a set is very similar to an array, is just without duplicate values. So we don't really need like a key value pair kind of thing, because there's no such thing as that in a set. It's very similar to just an array where each individual value is inside of there. So we can actually just get back each value, and it gets treated pretty much exactly the same way as we saw the array being treated right here with this for of loop. All right. Now for the interesting one, I'd like to show you what happens with objects. And this is another reason why there's many differences between maps and sets and objects in JavaScript, and why I encourage the use of the appropriate data structure or type for the problem that you're trying to solve. So let's look at this as a final example. So we'll do for of objects.js. So I'll create a, let's just say that this is a stock item. Okay, like in a store or something. Maybe the item has an ID, maybe the ID is 54, maybe it has a price of $1.32, and maybe it has a name. Let's just say that this is an apple, and maybe it has a quantity of, let's just say there's 6 of these. Okay. Great. So now that we have this stock item, how would we be able to actually loop through this object using a for of loop? Is it even possible? Let's take a look. So we'll say for const item of stock item, we can do console.log item. All right, let's try this. So we get, I'll run node and then for of objects, and oh my goodness, we have an explosion of stuff happening. So if you look carefully here, it looks like we're having this type error. Stock item is not iterable. So that's that fancy word that keeps coming up, an iterable, right? That's something that can be looped through, as I mentioned earlier, and a couple of other things. So it's saying that this error is happening because we're trying to use this for of loop, which only works on iterables with an object, which apparently is not one of these fancy iterables. All right, so here is kind of the issue with objects, and this is why I encourage you to use maps if you're just trying to store data in JavaScript. There are definitely use cases for objects, as I mentioned in the maps versus objects video, and we'll see lots of examples of this as we work through more complicated projects. However, if you want to loop through the keys and values in an object, this works quite differently. We first have to turn it into an array of those keys and values, and then we can loop through it. So for example, let me just pull up the documentation for objects really quick. So if I go to Google and then I say JavaScript objects, we'll go to my favorite documentation, working with objects, JavaScript. This is actually not what I want to do. JavaScript object maybe. And there we go. You can see that as we're Googling, definitely takes some practice to actually figure out where you want to go. In this case, I had even just a plural of objects, kind of gave me different search results. Get into the habit of trying to play with your search results to try to get to the documentation that you're interested in. Turns out even just the letter differences make a big difference. So I'll just go to object here for JavaScript. And it looks like this is the object page. So it has all this information about how objects work. We saw this in the objects video, properties, etc. We saw that objects have entries, which is right here, which is a method that returns an array of a given object's own enumerable string properties, string keyed property key value pairs. There's also object.keys, which is a method that returns an array of a given object's property names. And then there's object.values, which is a method that returns an array of an object's own values. Now notice, these are all arrays that get returned to us. We know that arrays are enumerable objects or iterable objects, right? Because we did that as our first example. We know that we can loop over them with a for of loop. Now notice over here as well that they have this for in loop, and you might be noticing why I'm not really mentioning that too much. There are very few use cases for this for in loop, and there are some very kind of edge case caveat things that will cause a lot of bugs if you're not aware of them. So to start, I want to avoid the for in loop, and I want to show you how you would use a for of loop to loop through the keys and values, just so that we can see how it works. For in can get kind of hairy in a lot of cases, so can these ones that I'm showing you, and this is the main difference between using objects to store things as well as maps. So enough said with that, let's actually just take a look at how this works. Let's say we want to loop through the key value pairs. I can do this, object.entries of the stock item. Okay, so if I do this, you'll notice that I actually get what looks like the same output as we had with our map, right? We're getting back arrays where each entry is a key value pair, with the first one being the property name, the second one being the value. Okay, now we went over this in the object video, but I just want you to be aware that this is giving us back an array. So when we execute object.entries of the stock item, it's going to it's a function that works with stock item, takes that object and gives us back an array of these arrays. Okay, so just to be super clear how that works, I just want to show this to you. So I'm going to copy this statement right here, and I'm going to print it out. And you can see that this right here is the array that we're looping over with this for of loop. And every single loop, we're getting back each item, which is what I named it, which is one of these. Okay. So similar to that, we can say object.keys, and if I run this, you'll see that we only get the keys, and then we can do object.values, and if I run this, you can see that we only get the values. Okay, so it really depends what you want from an object. Do you want the keys? Do you want the values? Do you want a combination of both? There are some caveats with this, and this is why I encourage the use of maps in a lot of cases instead of objects, just for storage purposes. However, there are a lot of cases where we would want to use these objects. For example, when we want to turn things to JSON, sometimes it's easier to use an object. However, you can still do that with a map. All right. So that said, I hope that kind of clears up some things and makes another tool in your repertoire for loops. I'm going to be using these for of loops quite often when it comes to our projects and kind of just going forward with this series in JavaScript. They are very useful, and one of the kind of functions in JavaScript that is used just kind of everywhere, right? Once you get used to writing these, unless you explicitly need things like the index or other things, you will see yourself using a for of loop quite a lot. There's another thing with certain types of objects called a for each loop, which we won't get into right now as well. That works very similar to how a map or filter might work. But generally speaking, this is kind of the corollary to the for loop that we saw before, where we're able to use the index and it just reads really, really nicely, and we'll use it a lot. All right. So what we'll do is in the next video, we'll go through a bunch of examples of this and exercises for this just to get even more practice, just so we can really kind of cement this and make a comparison of this compared to the for loops, especially now that we know all these different types of objects in JavaScript, like arrays, maps, sets, strings, and the object itself. That'll be really, really helpful. So if you want more practice, definitely check out that video. And if you found this video valuable, would really appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel as well. I'd love to hear in the comments, like, do you see yourself using this? Do you enjoy using this for of loop? Do you prefer the regular for loop? Or have you kind of looked at the other styles of loops, like the maybe for in loop or the for each loop? And maybe you can share what you feel is the most appropriate for which situation that you worked in. So that said, I'll see you in the exercises video. See you later.